Well, good evening and welcome to our Tuesday night Bible study. We are digging into the book and the prophecy of Ezekiel. And tonight, as we enter the book, we're going to have a look at the authorship. Well, in the opening verses, Ezekiel tells us that he is the author. But it is clear that there's probably some editing done by his disciples because it moves from the first person where Ezekiel says it talks about himself to then there's a comment in verse 3 about the hand of the Lord being on Ezekiel. So that's written not from the first person, but from the third. Now, I've put here that the conservative view that this book is written by Ezekiel and probably edited by his disciples is sadly a minority view. The commentators, when they're discussing this, they talk about the fact that those from a conservative position, that is, that the critical view of deconstructing the book ends up making a jumble and ends up splitting a book that actually presents a very coherent worldview that is speaking directly into the period that it's addressing. It's a period in the history of Judah when they have been taken captive by Babylon. It covers the period of the destruction of Judah and of the city of Jerusalem and of the temple itself, and then some few years afterwards. And Ezekiel basically, I think I've spelled Jehoiakim wrong, but anyway, he dates his ministry according to Jehoiakim's exile. Now, we can only look or make sense of the book if we can make a little bit of sense of the history. So, what we have in the preceding years prior to Ezekiel's prophecy is a battle for God's land. Now, remember, Israel is God's land. It is God's inheritance. And so I guess we have to say, well, let's meet the Assyrians. Well, the Assyrians had a huge empire. It kind of waned and it had its ups and its downs. But in the year 841, they begin to press into the area of the northern kingdom and the northern tribes. And so they demand a tribute from Jehu in 2 Kings 17. In other words, if Jehu doesn't provide a tribute, then they will come in and destroy him. However, by the time of Tiglath-Pileser and his son Shalman, oh, don't even ask me how to pronounce that, they really push into the northern kingdom. You can read that further into the book of 2 Kings chapter 17. And basically, by 702, they've come right down through the northern territories, and Sennacherib is now marching on the gates of Jerusalem. Hezekiah is the king at that point in history. But unfortunately, well, fortunately for him, and perhaps unfortunately for Israel, he sees the hand of the Lord delivering them and saving them as an affirmation of his kingship. And Hezekiah, at different points in his life, really did try to be a good king. However, just after, immediately after, Judah is saved by the angel of the Lord, and that's 2 Kings 19:35. In fact, it might be worth opening our Bibles and taking a look at that. Sorry, I've just come across your screen for a moment. But I'm going to turn to 2 Kings, and I'm going to read that verse at the end of chapter 19. So we have the situation where the angel of the Lord goes out and he cuts down 185,000 men in the camp of the Assyrians. And I assume that King Hezekiah probably felt quite good about himself. Well, that is until chapter 20. And Isaiah turns up, and Isaiah basically tells him in verse 16 to hear the word of the Lord. And he begins it by saying, behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and all that your fathers have stored up unto this day, it's all going to be taken to Babylon. Nothing will be left of it. This is the word of the Lord that Hezekiah hears from the prophet Isaiah. In other words, befriending the Babylonians is a really bad idea. But Hezekiah selfishly seems to feel that this is good news. And actually, in verse 19, he's thought to himself, then Hezekiah said to Isaiah, the word of the Lord that you have spoken is good. For he thought, why not, if there will be peace and security in my days? And eventually, at the end of the chapter, we read that he goes to his eternal rest. But unfortunately, he doesn't heed the warning of Isaiah of impending judgment. Now, Hezekiah knows what it is to repent. He knows what it is to plead for the Lord for mercy and to receive mercy. But towards the end of his life, he's selfish. And he thinks only about his own personal comfort. I know we say here in the UK that our politicians have forgotten that they serve people. That's why they're called ministers. They are servants to the people. Our taxes pay their wages. Here we have Hezekiah falling prey to that self-same thing. He forgets that his call as king is to serve the people. And then finally, in 6:12, Nineveh is destroyed, and you can read that in the prophecy of Nahum. Well, now I guess it's time to meet the Babylonians. And this is where it gets a little interesting. So on one side, we've got Nebuchadnezzar, we've got the kings and the events that are being, Nebuchadnezzar, the date of his coming to power, but then on the other side, it's almost like I've got two columns going here. So for those of you who can see it online, you'll see that it's literally a chart. On one side, what's happening on the side of the Babylonians, and on the other side, what's happening on the side of Israel. So date-wise, well, we can begin with the reign of Jehoiakim. He's king after the death of Josiah. He was perhaps the last good king of Judah, and he was allied with Assyria for some strange reason. Possibly it's a political motive to ensure stability and to prevent him being overrun by the Babylonians. Now, around this time, in 604, Nebuchadnezzar, who's the son of Nabopolassar, he comes to the throne. And one of the first things he does is he conquers Ashkelon. Now, Jeremiah has a very telling comment. In Jeremiah 25, verse 9, we read that God sends his servant Nebuchadnezzar as judgment on the king of Judah. And, maybe we should just read that together, because this is God speaking about his choice of instrument and how he is going to deal with the people. And here in Jeremiah 25, verse 9, we can read this. Behold, I will send for all of the tribes of the north, declares the Lord, and for Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. Oh, well, that's not really very good news, is it? Because this servant is going to come against his land, against its inhabitants, against the surrounding nations, and God says, I will devote them to destruction. And he speaks of a horror, a hissing, and an everlasting desolation. And in verse 10, God says, moreover, I will banish them, and I will take from them all joy. He says, I will banish from them the voice of mirth, the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride, grinding the millstones. Ooh, this is not a pretty picture. This is God expressing judgment. And I think that this is, and I was thinking about this, and I'll mention it later, but judgment is not something that we're comfortable with. We're much more comfortable with the God of love, the God who sends his son. For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever, this is warm, it is engaging, it is inviting. This would be the God of the new covenant in some thinking. But the God of the new covenant is the same God of the old covenant. And the way that God feels about sin here, as we read in Jeremiah and in Ezekiel, is the same way that he feels about sin at this very moment. But back in our Meet the Babylonians page, in 605, Nebuchadnezzar has the first siege of Jerusalem set in process. And Jehoiakim, who now is the son of Jehoiakim, he is now allied with Babylon. Unfortunately, this is not a good move because it results in his death. It results in his son taking over his kingdom. So the first siege, that actually, my friends, should be here Jehoiakim. Oops. There's an error on this page here because I duplicated and then I forgot to change it. Apologies. In 605, we still have Jehoiakim on the throne. And while he had previously been allied with Syria, he will be carried off. And he's killed in 598, and his son takes the throne, and he himself is exiled, and his uncle Zedekiah is made king. So you can see the two sieges, and in between those sieges, there is a war with Egypt. Now, the Jewish community lived in kind of three spaces in this period. We have a Jewish community in Egypt. We have the community that's left in the territory of the southern and northern kingdom. And we also have the community that will go to Babylon. So apologies, in 605 here, that is Jehoiakim, who had previously been allied with Assyria after Josiah, but he changes alliance with Babylon. And it's in this first wave of exiles that the prophet Daniel is carried off, and Ezekiel will be carried off in the second siege. and ultimately all the kings will be destroyed. Now, what were the objectives of these historical conquests of the land of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah? Well, the Assyrians, they divide and conquer. Their goal is assimilation. And what they did was they carried off the tribes and brought in others, and there was a mixing and a mingling. And what that resulted in was the loss of the northern kingdom and ultimately the loss of ethnic identity. And that was what the Assyrians did. The Babylonians, who are now coming in to conquer the southern kingdom of Judah, their goal is conquer and capture and carry off to exile. Their goal, their result is always the same: destruction, captivity, enslavement. And not only do they carry off artisans and soldiers, but they carry off and they strip out every piece of gold and silver they can to fund their ongoing war efforts. Now, the final rebellion is in 589, and that's around the time that Jerusalem is destroyed. Zedekiah, as I said, he's the last king here on the throne, and he will be captured. He had hoped to have an alliance with Tyre and Ammon, but that fails to materialize, and Babylon invades, and cities fall one by one, and ultimately Jerusalem falls. Zedekiah is carried off, and he is forced to watch his sons murdered, and he has his eyes gouged out. This is unutterable cruelty. The Babylonians wanted the last thing that this king, his last vision is that of the death of his sons. Now, the prophecies of Ezekiel, they date to a period around 20 years, covering the time before and after the destruction of the temple. And this is this moment when Nebuchadnezzar's general Nabuzaradan tortures the city, and ultimately Judah is gone, and a man called Gedaliah, who lives in a town just north of Jerusalem, he becomes governor. It's interesting, 2 Chronicles 36 verse 20 tells us that he carried off to Babylon those who escaped the sword, and they became slaves to him and his sons until the reign of the kingdom of Persia. Let's think a little bit about Ezekiel himself. Well, the dates imply that it gives us a kind of an idea of when he's born. Okay, so if we start with Ezekiel chapter 1, we learn that he is Ezekiel. He's a priest, the son of Bozi, and he's given a new calling, that of a prophet, and his new role is inaugurated with a vision. Now, using other dates within the book, it's traditionally believed that he was born around the year 622, and that is prior to Josiah's reforms. And he begins his prophecy in 593, and that's 5 years after his exile. And it's 5 years after the first deportations. It's interesting. I'm going to stop the share now because the rest of this will be in my notes and not on your screens. And I will fix that thing on the Jehoiakim. So where am I? In my notes. There we go. So we're thinking about Ezekiel. And it's assumed that, again, his prophecies begin in the year 593. That's 5 years into the deportations. Now, we also learn in verse 1 something about Ezekiel. And I mentioned it in our introduction, but it's worth mentioning it again now because it has to do with his own expectations. And it says, in the 30th year of the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, I was among the exiles by the Chebar Canal. Well, what was this 30th year? Well, no one can really seem to make any connection between any of the historical events. And so it's assumed that we're talking about his age here. And the fact that in the Jewish tradition, he would have begun his prophetic, this is when he begins his prophetic ministry. But if he had been in Israel, if he had not been carried off into exile, he would have begun his service in the temple. And it strikes me that it must have been a very hard time for Ezekiel, not just because he's in exile, not just because he's living in what could be called an internment camp, but because the hopes that he had had for his future have been dashed. And instead of beginning his priestly service, God in his grace and mercy had another plan for Ezekiel. And it involved a different kind of service. And it's interesting because the role of prophet and the role of priest share a similarity. They stand between God and man. The priest in the temple, of course, stands between God and man and represents man before God. The prophet does the opposite. He, of course, stands between God and man. But here, what he's doing is he's representing God to the people. And so the ministry of prophet and the ministry of priest share this similarity. They are ministering between God and man and God. Now, as we move into it, there is an addition. And when we read it in English, we don't really notice it. So let's just go over to Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 3. So the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel. And here you can see that now this is not Ezekiel speaking, but one of his, no doubt, disciples who were adding and editing after the fact. So the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the Chebar Canal, and the hand of the Lord was upon him there. Now, in English, we just read the hand of the Lord was upon him. But in Hebrew, where we would read the hand was upon him, it's repeated. And this is for emphasis. This is to let us know that the hand of the Lord was powerfully on him. And I think that is something that we need to see and take note of because it's there in the scripture. Now, Ezekiel's ministry, like that of Moses and Isaiah, begins with the hand of the Lord and a vision, a glorious vision. Now, the glory of God is a key theme in the book of Ezekiel, along with the theme of divine judgment. The fact that his prophecy is ultimately concerning the destruction of the temple and the glory of the Lord departing from the temple. This isn't exactly good news, because when the glory of God departs from the temple, God is going to allow that temple to be destroyed. Historically, and you may have heard me say this before, historically, the Talmud tells us that there were a number of miracles that occurred in the temple, one of which was connected to the Yom Kippur sacrifice. Now, interestingly, the Talmud records that about 40 years prior to the destruction of the temple, all of the miracles stopped happening. Now, what happened about 40 years before the destruction of the temple? The ministry of ministry of Jesus took place. And it's a fascinating historical quirk that I'm sure God put there for a reason. And one day the Jewish people are going to go, oh, how could we have missed this? How could we not have seen the connection between the coming of Jesus the Messiah and the ending of all of the miracles that we saw and experienced in the temple? And interestingly, just as here in the book of Ezekiel and this portion of history, as the glory of the Lord leaves the temple is destroyed. The glory of the Lord could not remain in the temple after the coming of Jesus, because Jesus comes as the manifestation of the person and the glory of God. The Apostle Paul tells us that the glory of God shone in the face of Jesus. Therefore, the glory of the Lord could no longer reside in the temple. And the minute the glory of God is removed from the temple can be destroyed. And exactly after the death of Yeshua, within 30, 40 years, the temple is gone. It's destroyed. And there is this connection and a parallel here in the book of Ezekiel with the events of the ministry of Jesus. As I said, like Moses and Isaiah, his ministry begins with a vision. Interestingly, one of the Puritan scholars describes the book of Ezekiel as being full of majesty, obscurity, and difficulty. Well, we're going to see just how obscure and how difficult this book is going to get as we move further into it. But I think there are some eternal truths that will help us, that will challenge us, and will bless us. So it's worth noting that the prophet Daniel would have been well aware of Ezekiel's prophecy, and it's thought that it would have provided Daniel ways of envisioning and portraying his own visionary impartations, the things that he saw and experienced. But I guess we have to begin to ask the question, what did Ezekiel see? And what did it mean? Well, we're going to have to deal with the fact that this is a theme of judgment. And in his inaugural vision, this chariot, this mobile throne of God, comes from the north, comes from the place where historically Israel's enemies and invading armies have come. In other words, it's telling them that the invading armies are being sent from the north by God himself. When you read through Ezekiel chapter 1, and let's take a moment to read some of it. So let's read from verse 4. I looked, and behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth occasionally. And in the midst of the fire, as it were, gleaming metal. And from the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures. And this was their appearance. They had a human likeness, but each had 4 faces, and each of them 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the soles of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on their 4 sides, they had human hands, and 4 had their faces and their wings thus. Their wings touched one another. Each of them went straight forward without turning as they went. And as for the likeness of their faces, each had a human face. The 4 had the face of a lion on the right, the face of an ox on the left, and the 4 had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces, and their wings were spread out above. Each creature had 2 wings, each of which touched the wing of another, while 2 covered their bodies. And each went straight forward. Wherever the Spirit would go, they went, without turning as they went. And as for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches moving to and fro among the living creatures. And the fire was bright, and out of the fire went forth lightning. And the 4 living creatures darted to and fro like the appearance of the flash of lightning. And now, as I looked at the 4 living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth side beside the living creatures. Each one had 4 of them. And as for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like that of gleaming beryl. Are you following this? Because I think I read this about 5 or 6 times, and I'm still not sure that I'm following it. But I think that this vision is not meant to be interpreted literally. Well, let's continue. And when the living creatures went, the wheels went beside them. And when the creatures rose from the earth, the wheels also rose. Wherever the Spirit wanted to go, they went, and the wheels rose along with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When those who went, these went. When those who stood, these stood. And when those rose from the earth, the wheels rose along with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. And over the heads of the living creatures was the likeness of an expanse, shining like awe-inspiring crystal, spread out above their heads. And under the expanse of their wings were stretched out straight, one towards the other, and each creature had 2 wings covering its body. And where it went, I heard the sound of their wings, like the sound of many waters, like the sound of the Almighty, a sound of tumult, a sound like that of an army. When they stood still, they let down their wings, and there came a voice from above the expanse of their heads. When they stood still, they let down their wings. And so, as you can see, it's slightly repetitive. But each time there's a repetition, there's something new. And above the expanse of their heads, there was the likeness of a throne in the appearance of sapphire. And seated above the likeness of the throne was the likeness with a human appearance. And upward from that had the appearance of his waist. I saw, as it were, gleaming metal, like the appearance of fire enclosed all around. And downward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw, as it were, the appearance of fire, and there was brightness around him, like the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud on the day of rain. So the appearance of the brightness all around. Such was the appearance and the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of the Lord speaking. Wow. Well, the first thing, I don't know if you've noticed, it reads very much like the beginning and the opening of Revelation chapter 1. In fact, just in chapter 1, we will see there are two chapters in Revelation. So we have the word of the Lord, and we see that in Revelation 1:19, when the word of the Lord comes to John, and John is called to speak what he sees. He's to write it down, he's to record it, he's to speak it. And again, he comes with a word to each of the 7 churches. And some of these words are words of judgment. In fact, they're all words of judgment. They've either done well or they've done badly. Now, we also have the appearance of the Lord. And we get that in Ezekiel and in Revelations chapter 1 and in chapter 5. And then we've got the scene, the throne. And we grasp a little of it in chapter 1, but really it's clearer in chapter 4 of Revelation as well as chapter 1. And then, of course, we have the living creatures. And that, again, they pop up mainly in Revelation chapter 4. Now, I did a little study this evening when I was thinking about this. When we look at John and Ezekiel, they are both bringing a message of judgment. Ezekiel is speaking fundamentally to the rebellious and sinful people in Judah. And in his prophecy, he will address Judah as Israel. And despite the impending judgment to come, I think God wants them to know that he is still with them. Now, Ezekiel is not alone in having seen or experienced the glory of God. Moses met with the glory of God at the burning bush. Israel met with the glory of the Lord at the foot of Sinai at the giving of the law. Aaron at the inauguration of the tabernacle, when the glory, the kavod of God came and filled it. We see it also at the inauguration of the temple. Isaiah, of course, has his own experience of the glory of God when the coal is taken from the fire and touches his lips to cleanse him. What makes Ezekiel's vision unique is that the glory of the Lord is not, it's not in the bush, it's not on the mountain, it's not in the tabernacle, and it's not in the temple. It is everywhere. It is mobile. And God is present. And as I said, it's not good news because his presence has been withdrawn from the temple. As we look at this vision, in one commentary, Dugged notes that the imagery of the Lord riding on the storm, surrounded by fire and lightning, was a common way of describing the coming of a warrior. But listen to what the psalmist has to say, because you can't read this vision and not refer back to other portions of scripture where we can see something similar. In Psalm 18, verse 6, we read, "In my distress I called to the Lord. To my God I cried for help. From his temple he heard my voice, and my cry reached his ears. Then the earth reeled and rocked. The foundations also of the mountains trembled and quaked, because he was angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from his mouth. Glowing crisp coals flamed forth from him. He bowed the heavens and came down. Thick darkness was under his feet. He rode on a cherub and flew. He came swiftly on the wings of the wind. He made darkness his covering, his canopy around him. Thick clouds with water, and out of the brightness before him, hailstones and coals of fires broke through his clouds. The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the Most High uttered his voice. Hailstones and coals of fire. So I think you can see some of the parallels going back to the psalmist's vision, through Ezekiel's vision, and forward all the way into the vision of John in the book of Revelation. In revealing himself to Ezekiel, he's showing himself as the one before whom all Israel must give an account. And if I were Ezekiel rather, and I was praying and God revealed himself to me in this way, I think I would be falling on my face as well. Now, Ezekiel, coming from a priestly family, would have had a great concern for the glory and the holiness of God. But he's in exile among a people who are suffering, and God reveals himself in all of his holiness, in all of his glory, and the only response that Ezekiel or any human being could have is to fall down in worship, just as John did when he received his vision of Jesus. But for the purposes of his vision, it's worth noting that judgment is not a comfortable theme. It's not a popular theme in our contemporary church. It strikes me that we want God to be the God of love, but we're not comfortable with his lordship at times. We do everything that we can to make those who come into church feel welcome, wanted, and perhaps even safe. But there is no escape from God's divine judgment, which began in the Garden of Eden with the sin of Adam and Eve. They were cast out of the Garden of Eden, and the Lord placed cherubim as guardians of it. And I was thinking about this, and I was remembering that I read a statement by a modern Orthodox rabbi who said, from the moment God cast Adam and Eve out of the garden, he set in motion a plan to restore his presence to humanity. And of course, for the Jewish community, they would see that through the giving of the law. But that was really only the first step, because the giving of the law only takes us so far. Paul calls the law a guardian, put in charge to lead us to Jesus. I was really struck by this, and I'm challenged by the notion of God's ongoing wrath. We assume that because Yeshua, Jesus, paid for the sin of humanity, that God's wrath has been appeased. But God disciplines those whom he loves. And God, if we believe that God's wrath has been appeased, if we do not take seriously, and here's the point of the connection to the churches in Revolution in the book of Revelation, God still comes with a word of warning. He comes with a word of judgment, and that is despite their faith in the risen Lord Jesus, despite the fact that they are supposedly Christians, supposedly men and women of God walking in God's ways. But clearly, in some of the cases failing. And so God still has a hatred of sin. The prophet Ezekiel is very concerned with the holiness of God. And I think the question would be, how concerned with the holiness of God are we? How seriously do we take? How do we respond to God's holiness? Now, I will probably need to mention a few other things about this vision, but I'll do it next week before we move in to chapter 2, because in chapter 2, we have his call, but the call is actually connected to the vision. So the things that I haven't got to tonight in describing and pulling out some of those elements of the vision, I will do so next week. I didn't cover the cherubim. And interestingly, if you look at the role of the cherubim, I'm going to leave that as a little teaser for next week. We will see their role and how God sees them. But one thing is for sure, they're the guardians of God's holiness, and you'll find out why by joining me next week. I didn't catch that.
Could you try again?
Siri, be quiet. Okay.